And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Andre Silverman, medical doctor with a background in physics, who has been conducting research on the mind-matter continuum, near-death experiences, and the Shroud of Turin. Dr. Silverman, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
So how did a man like you go from a world of academia into NDEs and the Shroud of Turin?
Well, it actually happened quite a long time ago. When I was the interest was first sparked. A friend of mine showed me video of a documentary, which was actually a BAFTA award-winning documentary in the UK called The Silent Witness. It was a video about the scientific research that had been done on the Turin Shroud. And it related to a team of scientists in the late 70s who had been given several days round-the-clock access to the Shroud. And these were people from Los Alamos, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, for example. These were scientists who went there with no particular idea in advance of what they were going to find, and they just expected that they would go there, see the brushstrokes, as it were, in 5 minutes, and then they could go back home again. And of course, much to their great surprise, what they found when they examined the Shroud in detail was that the image on there has certain unique properties, and that they realized that it wouldn't be possible, even using 20th, or now it's known even with 21st century technology, one wouldn't be able to reproduce all the features that the Turin Shroud image had. The scientists who were discussing how the image might have got there made a suggestion on the documentary that really got me thinking. They said it looked as though the image could have formed by a short, intense burst of radiant energy from the body of the man that the Shroud once wrapped. Now, I was at high school when I watched this documentary and learning about physics and so on, and biology, and it struck me that what would be really fascinating would be to try to have a consistent explanatory theory of how such a process might be possible within science. It was after that, of course, I became a medical doctor, and then I was still interested in how to do this, and because it occurred to me that the only way that all of the evidence points to the man of the Shroud, the man whom the Shroud wrapped, having been the historical Jesus of Nazareth. Now, that may sound a big claim to make, and it does require a lot of evidence to back that up, but that evidence does exist. I probably need to get out of the way to start with, because a lot of your viewers may have heard about the 1980s carbon dating that was done on the Shroud. Well, some excellent research by a husband and wife couple, Sue Benford and Joe Marino, in around just over 20 years ago. They discovered very compelling evidence that the corner from which the sample was taken for the carbon dating by the carbon dating team, was actually not at all representative of the rest of the cloth. That the evidence suggests that this was largely composed mostly of material that had been woven into the Shroud many centuries later, probably around the 16th century, because the corners were the most damaged, and people used to take bits off it to give away or sell as relics or whatever, and so it had been repaired. And they put this evidence to one of the STURP members, Raymond Rogers, who was a chemist based at Los Alamos Laboratories. And and up until the carbon dating, he'd been convinced by the evidence that this couldn't be a medieval forgery, because we don't even know in the 20th century how to make an image like this. But when the carbon dating came out, he said, being a man of science, well, if this is what the evidence suggests, that it's medieval, maybe it's medieval. I don't know how it's possible, but we have to follow the evidence. And when Benford and Marino contacted him, he said that he was sort of a bit annoyed that what he would call at the time, when these fringe researchers would be trying to question the evidence that science had shown, and he said, "I've got the evidence that I'd probably be able to prove them wrong in a very short amount of time," because he had access to fibers from near to the corner where the dating sample was taken, and also samples from elsewhere on the shroud. And he was a chemist, so he wanted to test the hypothesis: are they actually similar? Is the corner from which the sample was taken representative of the rest of the cloth? And he did the testing, and then he realized, and he went on the record to say, "I set out to prove them wrong. I've proved them right. The corner from which the sample was taken is totally not representative of the rest of the cloth chemically. It's completely different. It has cotton woven into it that is not found on the rest of the cloth, and it being a linen cloth." And he actually published his research on that in a peer-reviewed scientific journal called Thermochemica Acta, that showed that the carbon dating was not reliable. So anyway, the evidence suggested that it was formed by a short, intense burst of radiant energy from this. What we can see using forensic techniques was the dead body of a man that the shroud had wrapped. Okay, so this dead body of a man let out this intense burst of radiant energy that scientists have found would probably have been in the ultraviolet range. There's some great research done by a physicist, Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro, based at the Atomic Energy Institute in Frascati near Rome. And so the question is, how did this happen? And further to that, on hearing about research of a US physician, Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, who's done a lot of very empirical research that is, fully backed up by the evidence, that he demonstrated that at the time that the image formed, the body of the man would have been upright, but not standing, because the position of the feet shows that he wasn't standing. So when when the bloodstains formed, the body was supine. It was lying flat, and the Turin shroud, which was as it were folded over the top of the head and so on. So there's the bloodstains from the front and the back, but the image is different. The image appears as though the man was upright, or the body was upright, and the shroud was hanging down from the top of his head at the front and at the back, and was flat rather than curved around the body. So that was what the task I set myself, was try to account scientifically for why a dead body would become upright and suspended above the ground and let out this short, intense burst of radiant energy. And it occurred to me that it wouldn't be surely not coincidence that this, as far as we know, unique event in human history was associated with this particular individual who is unique in terms of what he taught and how he lived. And interesting that 20th century scientific research points to the moment of image formation, him having been suspended above the ground and a burst of intense radiation coming from him, and that wouldn't have been apparent to people in medieval times looking at the cloth, that was the case. And yet this particular individual, Jesus of Nazareth, is reported, at least during his life, while he was before he died, for both of those things to happen, that he was seen to become as if weightless, walking on water, and he went upon a mountain and was seen to be shining. So it was fascinating to me that that there was a concordance between what the scientific evidence showed may have happened after he died, and reports that was suggesting that such events may have occurred during his lifetime. And so because I was asked to present a paper about the Shroud, actually, my first paper that I presented was at Frascati at a symposium that was organised by Dr. De Lazzaro, the physicist who I was referring to earlier, who did the research on ultraviolet radiation. And in doing that, I realised that I had to tie in mind and matter together to understand how there could be a correlation between what he taught and how he lived, and how such an event were possible. And so that's really what I did in the book. So in my book, it's only about 30% is about the Shroud, but I consider the question of what is consciousness, what is a human being, what is their potential, because this man demonstrated what human beings are capable of. And interestingly, in terms of how he's been quoted in what's nowadays called the Gospels, but then, was presumably reported speech from people hearing what he said. That he said, all these things you see me do, you can do also, and greater than these can you do. So he was alluding to something that may have been, and for example, I was alluding to him being seen walking on water, but it's interesting that Peter is also said to have been seen to walk on the water, and then in a moment of possible doubt or confusion in his mind, then he started to think. So it seemed to be, this is fascinating because it ties in the question of consciousness and mind and thought with matter, gravity, mass, and what is matter, how is it related to space and time and consciousness. And so I explore these in great depth in the book, and I was helped in doing so by realizing that although a lot of people think this is a sort of fringe thing to think about consciousness and its effect on matter, what I realized very early on is that if one thinks about it, people say, is there such a thing as extrasensory perception? Is there such a thing as mind over matter? As though these are unsolved questions. And yet, if you think about it, and this isn't new, this is ancient Indian texts going back many thousands of years. In the Upanishads, this point was made, that it's not your eyes that see, it's not your ears that hear. Somehow there is something behind the eyes and between the ears. And that, by now, I'm not just referring to electronic processes in the brain, which are just electronic processes in the brain. Beyond that is a conscious mind that is perceiving those things. And if it's perceiving those things beyond the senses, then even you looking at me now, or your viewers looking at you now and perceiving you, that perception, although their eyes are receiving the photons of light from their screens, their perception is not happening within their senses, it's extrasensory. And every time we make an action, if free will is real, and everyone, arguably does believe in free will, even if they say they don't, otherwise there's no point in giving credit or blame to people for their actions if they think they would have done them anyway. Well, free will is mind over matter. So actually, although we question whether these things exist, we all know they exist. It's sort of a kind of doublethink. And I looked back at the history and philosophy of science and saw that the great Nobel laureates, for example, who founded quantum physics, like Erwin Schrödinger, Max Planck, who were interviewed, and in my book, I've got the actual quotes from them that I've had verified by the archives of a newspaper in the UK called the Observer. In the 1930s, each of them was interviewed about what do they think consciousness is and where does it come from. And both of them said they believe it's fundamental. It's not the product of anything else. It's not the product of matter. That, of course, fits in with NDEs because the brain stops functioning and people are still conscious. And also, it's not just people think, oh, that's physicists of the past, but then there's been progress since that. And of course, now they realize that no. Look at the writings and speech of Andre Linder, who's one of the top cosmologists in the world. He's a professor at the University of Stanford in the US. And he actually included in his textbook the statement that all the evidence points to him to the conclusion that consciousness is fundamental. It doesn't begin with the universe in a very real sense, because consciousness is essential to exist in order for space, time, and matter to exist. We, as in conscious beings, are in some real sense the creators of the physical universe. And I saw he was interviewed on a site called Closer to Truth. And the interviewer said to him, when you put that in your textbook, weren't you worried that you might lose the respect of your friends and colleagues? And he said, if I didn't include it, I'd lose my self-respect. So the book really sort of ties in this notion of how consciousness is related to how we are related to each other through consciousness as human beings, how space, time, and matter are related to consciousness, how that we can see using simple reasoned argument that consciousness has to be eternal, and how that relates to the Turin Shroud and also to near-death experiences.
I'm not sure what specialty you practice, but I'm sure if you talked to anyone who works in the hospice arena, the nurses and the doctors, they would say that they've never seen this light burst event happen like which happened with Jesus.
Yes.
So is it possible that Jesus actually had an NDE, and when he came back to his body, this explosion of light happened, and then
Right.
he moved on and lived his life as some people believed he did, and never actually ascended to heaven, but moved to
Okay.
India or somewhere else?
Well, forensically, the evidence suggests that he was already dead when he was wrapped in the cloth. So it wasn't an NDE; it was a DE that he had.
Mhm.
It was
Right.
a death experience, and that's based on the sort of scientific evidence. You see, um, in fact, I'm very happy to call Dr. Lavoie, the researcher I referred to earlier, as a friend. So I know him, and we've spoken before. And it was he who pointed out to me, actually, although I'm a medical doctor myself. That's why I could see that what he was saying was true. He was saying that, of course, this man must have been dead if he was wrapped in the cloth. He said, Andrew, you've worked in ERs, haven't you? And then I said, yes. And he said, what have you seen when people have scalp lacerations? Because we haven't mentioned it, but the shroud shows that that this the man of the shroud, before he had died, had sharp objects on his head because there's blood coming down from the scalp. And Dr. Lavoie is absolutely right. Have seen it when people have scalp lacerations, they bleed very heavily. You get pretty much sort of covered in blood because the scalp is very vascular tissue, very good blood supply. And what he actually discovered from his, again, empirical research using blood and on linen and so on, is that it quickly dries within about 90 minutes, depending on temperature, humidity, and so on. And once it's dried, then you don't get stains from contact from the cloth. But also, once someone is alive, if they've got scalp lacerations, they don't stop bleeding that quickly. So the fact that there's only a small amount of blood on the cloth implies that he'd already stopped bleeding, which means that his circulation had stopped, which means he was dead. So the man of the shroud had died. Now, it's interesting that you refer, actually, I have worked in hospices before, and also having spoken to other near-death experience researchers, they've collated a lot of evidence from around not just the experience of the person who has almost died and been resuscitated, but also of people who are around people who die. And it seems that a lot of healthcare professionals and relatives have described seeing when someone dies that it looks like something is coming out of the body. It's not a sudden burst of light, but it looks as though if the person is lying flat, that they see the top of their head rising up, as it were, from their forehead, and the whole body coming out from them and seeming to go up through the ceiling at the moment of death. That lots of people have apparently apparently seen this, but that doesn't really relate to, I believe, to what we're seeing on the Shroud, which is a separate event that happened. And it's interesting in terms of the description of the what happened with this particular individual, that people say that after he had died, that several days later, then he seemed to come back. It's a bit more, rather than an NDE, that there may have actually, that what people refer to as a resurrection, that may actually have happened, something like that. And the shroud image may be a physical effect of that. I don't consider that as a religious artifact, because I don't think religion needs to come into it. This is an archaeological artifact that has scientific evidence of an event that happened. That this goes beyond faith and dogma. I mean, I should say something also about myself. I come as a lot of the several of the STURP team. That's the science team who went in the 70s to do this scientific research. One of the famous ones who sadly died recently, Barry Schwartz. He was photographer for the project, and he recorded lots of wonderful photos of that. And he was one of the STURP team. And he said when he received the call to asking if he wanted to join the team, he said, "You do realize I'm Jewish?" And I think, if I don't want to misreport him, but I think the guy who was replying to him was also happened to be Jewish as well, and he said that you know, that if this was Jesus of Nazareth, he was also Jewish. You know what? And anyway. But the point is that they didn't look at the shroud, and neither do I, from a religious perspective, but from an empirical and scientific one. And to me, I see. I don't. If you look at the sort of the life of the man of the shroud, when people came at him with religious questions, he would always sort of look at them in a sort of more of a rational sense, that if what he said is true and makes sense, then it can be seen to make sense through reason, and we may actually have scientific evidence that actually verifies that. Because if he achieved what he did through living his life in the way that he did, then I go into, you know, much more depth in the book, but how that could have made such a thing possible. Now, to give an introduction to that, I should let you know that there was a very eminent physicist by the name of David Bohm, Professor David Bohm, and he became also, like some of the others that I've mentioned, interested in the interface between matter and consciousness in a sort of scientific way. And he was once interviewed and asked, why is it that you think that there's this common theme that when referring to spirituality, people talk about light? Because Bohm was a quantum physicist, so obviously light and matter come under that subject. And he said that the interesting thing about it is that for light, and this is based on what Einstein discovered in relativity, that for a light beam, as it were, or for a photon, that the beginning and end of its path are one and the same in space and time. There's no distance traveled, and there's no time elapsed. So in a sense, Bohm pointed out that light reflects, that the idea of light reflects a kind of unity, a oneness that exists under the surface of reality, that consciousness is fundamentally one. And he made the point that the word individual actually comes from a root meaning undivided, and Schrödinger made this point as well, that fundamentally we're all one, which is interesting because as I go into great depth in the book to explain, I believe there's evidence that consciousness is cannot be the product of matter. Schrödinger said this too. It cannot be the product of space, it cannot be the product of time. Okay, and what Schrödinger actually said, to be more specific, was that time itself is the product of consciousness because only consciousness is now. There's only a moment now because of consciousness. Otherwise, the whole history of the universe, from the Big Bang to the heat death of the universe, might as well be all one. But it's only to us as conscious observers that there is a now. And he said, because time is the product of mind, I venture to call the mind indestructible, because that which the mind has brought to the fore, meaning time, because time is made by mind, then the mind, not the consciousness, if you like, cannot have a beginning or an end in time, because time itself is a product of consciousness. So it cannot begin or end, because for it to, time would have to be there before it. But time can't be there before consciousness because consciousness is what makes time. So the interesting thing is that for the physical universe, space, time, and matter do appear scientifically to have had a beginning. Okay. And for space to have a beginning means separation has a beginning. You don't need to study physics to understand that space is another word for separation. You have the separation of points if you have space. Now, if space and time began at the Big Bang, there was no separation beyond that. I won't say before that, because before would imply time. Okay, so beyond the Big Bang, there's no space or time, there's no separation, but there is consciousness, because consciousness doesn't need time and consciousness made time. So therefore, we all exist as one, all consciousness together, beyond the Big Bang in a timeless state, which means being timeless, it must still be here now. So perhaps I suggest in the book what Jesus was referring to as the Father, which he also referred to as our Father, is that oneness that we all are together, shorn of all of our things that keep us stuck in a universe that breaks everything apart according to the second law of thermodynamics, that divides, where we have death, pain and sufferings, moth, rust and thieves and so on. But we're here and we keep ourselves here, not because there's a God in the sky who's punishing us or telling us we have to be here, but I argue we're here because we've made ourselves here because of our restrictions, all the things that divide: selfishness, materialism, racism, nationalism, sexism, whatever, ageism, most of these isms that try to say that some human beings don't matter. They are what divide us. And because if we are fundamentally all one, anything we do to each other, we're doing to ourselves. And so we're keeping ourselves restricted because of our distorted, twisted, prejudiced, limited, ignorant view of each other. And that's what keeps us stuck here.
When we leave this body and move to the other side, are we still trapped in those beliefs, and that's why we keep reincarnating?
Well, to me, that would make sense. That if you study NTEs as I have, and the evidence from them, what you see is that very often, after people have seen that light that they often describe initially, many people describe seeing scenes from their life, but experiencing them all together. And this is where probably the term seeing one's life flash before you comes from, which was, I believe, a term that was used before it became common knowledge that lots of people have NDEs. But the way that people often describe it is that what they perceive is everything that they did to others, they experience that as though being done to them. So any act of kindness that they did, they feel the warmth, for want of a better word, or the light of that in themselves. And anything that they did that was spiteful or was in some way harmful to others, they feel what that was like. They do have a sense sometimes of a guide who's with them, talking them through it, but they don't feel judged by that angel, God, or whatever we call it. They, in a sense, they are actually, their conscience is judging them, their own conscience. And so that would make sense as well, that what is often termed karma within sort of Eastern philosophies is simply what Newton in his third law referred to as action and reaction. That for every that there's an effect of everything that one does, and what we do uh, that that causes harm to others also causes harm to us. And that's why we can't really sort of forgive ourselves of that unless we put it right. And so perhaps, and interestingly, people think reincarnation is only something that's mentioned in the religions of the Indian subcontinent and so on. But actually, that's not the case. It actually was there in all religions at the start. Take, for example, Read Without Prejudice, if viewers read without prejudice, the discussion that Jesus is said to have had with his apostles when he was asking who do people say that I am? And someone says, well, people say that that, for example, you can't be the Messiah because the people say that Elijah has to return before he comes. And Jesus didn't, I don't think, commented on the Messiah term, but he said that I tell you, he has already come and people didn't recognize him. Elijah has already come and people didn't, or Elias, I think he's called in the English version. Has already come and people didn't recognize him. And the text says that the people he was talking to understood that he was talking about John the Baptist. Now that's fascinating because, of course, there are some of your viewers may know about the Gnostic Gospels, the Nag Hammadi, and so on, which actually may have been kept out by what became after the Roman Church after Constantine sort of decided that he was going to stop, that he wanted the Roman Empire was going to stop killing the believers in Jesus, who would instead become their leader or try to become their leader. But in meetings they decided which sort of books and so on would be included in the sort of liturgy of what was accepted. But even in what's now known as the Gospels, this is there. So what that was implying is that if the author of that is correct, that the apostles believed it would be consistent with what Jesus had taught them, that one man who had died might have come back as another man. So what's that if not reincarnation?
After speaking to so many near-death experiencers, many of them say that the most important thing we can do in life is random acts of kindness. In your opinion, is that the way out of reincarnation?
Well, I think that if I understand correctly, what the great teachers like Jesus and the Buddha and so on were alluding to, and I don't think they were trying to start religions. In fact, Jesus, when questioned about what is his purpose, what is he trying to achieve, he didn't say, I want to start an organization and have a hierarchy and institutions and buildings. He simply said he'd come to bear witness to the truth. But if you look at what they taught, it was more about what you are than just doing an act. So if the act is there because of what you are, then so if you do an act what you consider to be, it's only kind if you really, if it's natural to you, if you're doing it because you care. If someone says, right now I want to find a recipe of how do I escape the wheel of rebirth, I know I'm gonna I've got nothing on tomorrow, so I'm going to go around giving out presents to random people, and then I'll be okay. Then I'll get to heaven. That you're not being kind if you're doing that, because you're only doing it to help yourself. I think it's simpler than what you're saying, but also much deeper and also much more difficult. If it was easy, there'd be, thousands of Jesuses around. But there are examples of people. Obviously, I'm no judge of who is what, and the reason why I can say this about Jesus is because he gave there's physical evidence of it on the shroud. But from my sort of limited knowledge within my own limits, if I were to look at human history, there are people who I think have genuinely lived in the way that he was teaching. If you look at people whose life is devoted to the the limitless value of all humanity, and that they believe and feel that so deeply that it makes all their actions are promoted and made real by that. People like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, for example, that they weren't people who were, I mean, obviously I don't know, I'm no one to judge, so I'm only going by what history has recorded of them. But it would seem to me that those weren't people who were looking for a recipe. What do I do to get myself out of trouble to escape this universe? But they were people who profoundly cared about all human beings and couldn't bear to see the disease of the mind that limits human beings, to stop them recognizing each other's value. And they fought against those types of things, Gandhi fighting against colonialism, and Martin Luther King against racism, and so on. They're seeing the things that divide humanity, and they're seeing the hurt it does, and the harm it does, and the suffering that it causes, and they're just being voices of reason to remind us that actually we're all one. At the root level, all humanity is one, and that everything that we do to each other, we're doing to ourselves. And so there isn't I don't think there's a recipe book of things of acts to do, but first of all, we have to, the idea of what Jesus taught when he quoted Leviticus, love thy neighbor as thyself, that actually you have to be able to do that, you have to recognize your value as yourself. You have to be kind to yourself, and you have to see that there's immense, limitless value in you, but also in all other human beings. That there's a sort of spectrum, if you like, between empath on one side and psychopath on the other, where the psychopath has no sense that other human beings feel or experience things like they do, or if they do, that doesn't matter. It's totally irrelevant. Other people are like objects as far as they're concerned in many cases. Whereas then you get people who are their whole lives are devoted to what they want to do out of the recognition of the preciousness of all humanity. I think it's a realization that promotes a change in what one does, but also in what one is. But then again, you get, for example, the Buddha taught first do no harm. So even if one doesn't yet have that sense of how important every human being is and to care for them. At least if recognizing that even if you're doing it for selfish reasons, knowing that hurting others is going to damage you, well, stop hurting them. If by hurting them it means doing wrong to them that causes hurt.
So do you believe that collectively we are all God that has been separated into trillions and trillions of
Okay.
individual beings, or
Okay.
what's going on?
Yeah. So the word God is a slightly awkward one because it has millions of different meanings to millions of different people. But the this the state of us all being one, which exists beyond I argue beyond the Big Bang and is still there now, which is, if you think about it, it fulfills the criteria of being all knowing, all powerful, always everywhere and eternal. That just from using simple reason, and that never breaks apart because it's eternal. Because so God didn't divide up. Right, and we, because of our imperfections and things that and ignorance of each other's value and meaning, that means that to the extent that we have those qualities, that is not God. So we are not God, but in potential, we perhaps can be. But so this is, I think, what Jesus was alluding to if he said, "My Father and I are one and the same." But anyone who does my Father's will is my brother, my sister. So we would become that if we became it. We would have to. So I don't think that we. But actually, that was said to him that people. I think, if I'm not mistaken, someone said to him, "How can you be comparing yourself to God?" And he said, "Is it not written, 'Ye are gods and children of the Most High,'" which is a quote from or many people now call the Old Testament. That I can't remember where it was, but somewhere I think one of the prophets said, "Ye are gods and children of the Most High." Um, so I think yes, we do have that potential, but I would say it's a potential that we are not God if we're not like if the realized potential of the full potential of what humanity is capable of. Not so defining that potential, I would say lack of limit. So at the moment, I think that what people it's interesting that the word repent was found to people realized eventually that it came from a root meaning change your mind. From in the Greek it's metanoite, but even in English, pent is similar to the root of the word meaning to think, to sort of to rethink. that that actually that we don't need to have concepts like sin, but it's just a restriction of the mind. So if we are all fundamentally one, then to be selfish is to be restricted. To be racist is to be ignorant and therefore to be restricted. Then we're less than our full potential.
So what do you think Jesus meant by the kingdom of heaven is within?
Yes. So of course, this is only my speculation about it. I can't claim to be speaking on his behalf, and my guess is that because if I ever did have the privilege of meeting him, I think he would surprise me by what he says, because I think his knowledge is so vast and deep. But from my point of view, the what I would suspect he was referring to is that again into that potential, but also, you see, in a very real sense, although I said we are not that, we are not what people call God. What is the most if we say God is all powerful and all knowing, we have a sort of root of that in the sense that we have awareness. Now, that's something your computer, your camera, your phone, they don't have, and I argue in the book they never will have, is consciousness. So in order to be all-knowing, you have to start off with being knowing, right? And that's what all human beings are. Now, to be all-powerful, what is the most powerful thing? Is it if you have a stack of cards that are all nicely lined up and you push one of them over and then they all fall over? Is the card powerful because it makes the next one drop? Or are you powerful because you chose to push the first one? And I argue in the book that free will, if it exists, and I argue that whether or not we notionally believe in its existence, everyone knows it does exist. Otherwise, they wouldn't ascribe blame or credit to people for their actions because their actions were all predetermined. They didn't choose to do it anyway. And our legal systems imply free wills. Everything assumes that free will is real. But if it is real, and I argue that it is and present evidence that it is, free will is the primary cause because it means that nothing made you have to make the decision that you made. Okay? Now, galaxies, if we're excluding any life that might exist in them, the whole extent of the universe, again, if we take apart from any life that there might be out there, but that huge panoply that you see when you look at the stars that is unimaginably huge, and with so many forces and black holes and things that can destroy whole stars and planets, you might think that's powerful. And yet they have no choice. They're just following the laws of physics. Whereas each of your viewers, as human beings, has a power that they don't have. And I would argue it's the power of all power is the power to choose. See? So if we say that people define God as being all-knowing and all-powerful, and yet we have awareness and will. So that shows logically that we have that potential, but it has become restricted. The way that the Buddha, for example, the actual name was Siddhartha Gautama, who was a prince in India thousands of years ago. But he said, Buddha, just translated, means the awakened one. That he said all sentient beings are Buddhas, but they have become temporarily obscured. Remove that obscuration, and they are Buddhas indeed. Jesus also, and actually, the Buddha said, "Don't believe anything just because I've told you. Go and test it out for yourselves." And Jesus also alluded to reason, and in fact, he was actually way ahead of the game in terms of science because the second law of thermodynamics was discovered around over 1800 years later after him, and yet he recognized that this physical universe is one where everything breaks down, as he alluded to with moths, rust, and thieves, and he said there's another way beyond that. So yes, I think we do have that potential, but to achieve that potential would be a change of what we are that would come through recognition of the value of what we are and what each other is.
When you're out of this body and on the other side, many people say that time does not exist. And I think you would agree with that.
Okay,
But
so
let me follow it up with
sorry.
this. And if that's true, some people claim that while they're there, they have access to the past, present, and the future, or those three things are all happening at the same time. And you're saying that free will does not exist. Maybe in this realm, but if you do enter the other realm, can you access the future? Like, has it
Okay.
already happened?
Okay, I'm not saying, in fact, I'm saying the opposite. I'm not saying free will doesn't exist. I argue that free will does exist.
I mean, yeah, yes, yeah, that way.
Sorry. Okay. Um, so that's a very interesting point that you raise about the past, present, and future. And this is something that that your viewers can do what Einstein referred to as a Gedanken experiment, means a thought experiment, to understand about the nature of time. Okay. Which time do we experience? If one it sort of looks inward and considers how do we experience time, although we have this notion of time flowing, yeah, that would have no meaning at all, because how does time flow? What does it mean? 1 second per second? What is it flowing in? Actually, and this is again going back, sorry to keep quoting the Nobel laureate Erwin Schrödinger, physicist, but the mind is always now. That's a term, a word, a sentence that he once said, that we're always only in the present, that the past is what defines how the present came to be, and the future is the potentials that exist within the present, and we're always experiencing them all together, whether we are in so-called incarnate and discarnate, literally within meat, the flesh of the body, or beyond it. People often associate death with dead bodies and the body, and I think what NDE shows us is it's the wrong way around. That actually we're the ones carrying bodies around with us, and they're free of them. But that's not to say I always want to put a disclaimer when I say things like that, because I don't believe in suicide or anything like that. I think the state of being alive is very important, and there are things that we can do within physical life, changes that we can make. And that relates to your point about time, which would not be so readily done within the so-called discarnate state, or the state in between lives, because we can interact with each other, we can do things to help each other out, and to share, hopefully, wisdom, if wisdom is something that makes sense, is defined in that way, that enables us enables people to see beyond their restrictions, um, and which therefore helps unrestrict the person who's teaching them as well. Um, so, but to answer your question more directly, yes, I think what the NDEs show us is that within that state beyond the atom, that there is a clearer perception of existence and of the now. Our present already contains the past. Everything that you see that is around you you can trace back, that for it to have got there implies lots of things in the past. I mean, for those who are interested in science, all of the elements beyond helium were all made in stars, and they're around you. All the ones beyond iron were all made in supernovas. And you have elements beyond iron in your body and probably in the objects around you. So in a sense, even looking at the present, we are looking at at the past all the way back to the Big Bang. In fact, if you just look out at the night sky, you're seeing light that came from distant stars thousands of millions of years ago. And the physical unit, the Big Bang, is thought only to have happened fewer than 14 billion years ago. And you're seeing a good chunk of that into the past just through the light. In fact, if you, with an old style analog TV, if you put it between stations, or put an analog radio between stations, and you hear the white noise, a significant proportion of that signal is actually an echo from the Big Bang. It's called the cosmic microwave background. So it's all around us. All of the past is already here within the present. But that's the fascinating thing about how we exist in the now. We as conscious beings, with free choice, because the reason why the future hasn't happened yet is because there are choices still to be made. That all sentient beings are actually the creators of reality. Now, that doesn't mean that one has to, I always want to put a disclaimer on that, because it doesn't mean that anything bad that happens to people, that they chose it or they made it happen or it's their fault. It doesn't mean that. Remember the analogy of from chaos theory and science. The butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon, and that might cause a storm near you in Texas, for example. Now, let's say, for the sake of argument, that the butterfly can choose whether it flaps its wings. It's not choosing to make a storm. And if you get adversely affected by a storm, it's not necessarily because you've done something bad. It's just because the butterfly flapped its wings with no malice. It just flapped its wings. So actually, I argue that free choice is the fundamental cause of everything, absolutely everything, but that because we live in a chaotic universe, that it's not necessarily, and usually isn't, something that has directly been chosen. But it's by just existing in this physical universe, we're subject to. You mentioned random acts of kindness. We're subject to random experiences of tragedy that may be no one's fault, or sometimes, as a planet, the people on Earth, we may have some responsibility to each other not to cause bad things to happen, or to try to prevent them. But sometimes if an asteroid hits or something like that, it's just, these are the things that happen if you exist in a world with moth thrusts and thieves. But there's, I believe he alluded to, as all the great teachers did, a world beyond that, and they showed us a sort of a route map, as in being the way to not to need to have physical bodies.
What is the strongest piece of veridical evidence of NDEs that convinced you that they are real?
The thing is, my research has been, so to speak, looking at other. I haven't actually sort of interviewed NDE experiences so much, but there is so much. There's so much evidence of people who were originally very, very skeptical of the notion. If you take the example of Ibn Alexander, for example, who is a neurosurgeon, who up until the point of his NDE uh, believed that the brains that he was operating on, as far as I understand it, from having been to a talk that he did and spoken to him afterwards, was the product of the mind was actually made by the brain, and that if the brain stopped, then you stop, until he had the experience himself. And there is just, and he was very kindly wrote a sleeve note on my book, actually. But also, there are so many examples of, for example, the physician who was speaking to a patient who had an NDE experience. Your viewers probably know several of these examples, and probably know others, but besides them, but who. And in the NDE, this patient had been looking at the hospital from above and had seen some slippers on a ledge next to a window several stories up that they'd never been to. And the doctor went and looked, and there's just so many. And on this brings me on to another of my themes, because I was invited to attend a conference in the US of something called the Society for Scientific Exploration back in 2014. And this was to talk about my ideas about consciousness, mind and matter, space and time, and how they're related. And you see, one of the speakers immediately before me was someone who many of your viewers may be familiar with, a gentleman, a very learned expert by the name of Dean Radin, who has collated a huge amount of scientific research that from meta-analyses of studies on ESP and mind over matter and so on, to say that to show, to demonstrate, to prove that the chances of all of this evidence just being coincidental is way beyond trillions to one against. It would be so much. I think I worked it out once. The equivalent to someone winning the lottery every single day or every single week for a year, and then on top of that, putting a zero on every single atom in the universe and a one before it, and then 1 trillion, whatever it is, to one again. It doesn't make any sense at all. The evidence is so huge and so, to me, so undeniable that I believe we've reached a point now where we have to step beyond the question of whether such a thing is, whether there is extrasensory perception, whether there is mind over matter, whether there are NDEs, whether consciousness survives death, to beyond that and say, what does it mean? How does it work? What are we? Where do we come from? What determines how we continue? These are the relevant questions that otherwise we're just chasing our tails, looking at more and more evidence until what's going to be enough to convince us that how we could just go on forever. But I think it's already been proven way beyond any reasonable doubt that the brain doesn't make the mind.
From listening to you, I don't think you're a religious man, but if you put together all the information that you've collected and all the research you've done, what are your practical applications of this into your life? How do you lead your life and live your life now with all this
Yeah.
information?
I'm not probably a good judge of of how I live my life, and all I can say is, for sure, is with lots of mistakes. So I'm definitely no paragon of what I'm teaching about. This is why what I say, teaching or sort of purveying the information, sharing my insights for what they're worth, in the hope that people will consider them to see if they make sense. And if I'm not making sense, I want to be, people can prove me wrong, then I'll learn something. But so I wouldn't look for my life as any example of anything really. But we have lots of, in human history, we have lots of lives that are worth looking at. And I mean, Jesus and the Buddha are two examples. That I gave another example of Dr. King, of someone who, to my eyes and to my limited perspective, is demonstrating that principle of valuing all of humanity in its preciousness, and to see that it's limitless. It's the scope and value of all human beings is beyond giving any size or limit to whether they're a king or a pauper or a homeless person or whatever. It doesn't matter. They're all human beings. Anyone who has perception and choice, which all human beings do, that is a power beyond the size of all the atoms in the universe. So I think, as I said, in recognition of that leads, if anything, will lead, hopefully, to this notion of loving thy neighbor as thyself. That if we recognize enough that all human beings are one with us, that anything that we do to each other, we're doing to ourselves, then, which is what Jesus was alluding to, anything you do to the least of mine, you're doing to me, because he truly cared, not as a recipe. What should I do to escape this universe? What do I do to get eternal life? But because he knew it to be true, that all human beings were so precious to him, that was natural to him to act out of that knowledge.
Do you think Jesus was born human like the rest of us and just somehow figured all the stuff out and acquired knowledge? Or do you think he came here already with this information?
I think he was fully human, and he did come with all this information, which in a sense we do come with as well to some extent. It's just we don't see it. We don't look at it. So everyone, as I was alluding to, that we all have this knowledge that there is something behind our eyes that is perceiving the world, but we don't make the necessary steps to recognize that the value of that and how it relates to the value of all other human beings. So, however he was born, I do believe that he showed a pathway, which is why he referred to himself as the way of what anyone else could do. So, because that was the point that he was at pains to point out several times, and was quoted to do the same. For example, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Right? If he is seen as, if people were seeing him as the Son of God, but he was saying that others can be as well sons and daughters of God, and who he referred to as our Father. And what is a peacemaker? Now that's an interesting thing. And if you look at, in trying to understand the connection between mind and matter in a sort of scientific sense, what is the opposite of peace? Peace, you could argue, is the absence of force or enforcement. Okay, peace, calm, if you like. Now, the physical universe, atoms, are composed in many ways of fields of force, four different forces. So you've got gravity, electromagnetism, and strong and weak nuclear forces that they actually, in a very real sense, comprise, the matter is comprised of these things. But I was talking earlier about the nature of causation, saying that free will is the most powerful thing of all. But force, remember, is what makes something happen. Force is following that chain that is set in motion. For example, the force from your finger flicks the first card, that then the whole deck of cards that you've lined up into a house of cards all collapse, right? But your decision, right, to tell your, if you like, to tell your brain to send the signal to your finger to make it do that, that isn't forced to do what it is. That exists in a that will can only exist in a sense where there's no force, because you're not forced to do what you do if it's free. So in that sense, I would say that that force exists. That, like, you get a spring and you separate it out, that makes a tension, and that the same thing happens in physical universes, that we have gravity and so on. There's a tension because things are separate. So I would say that to undo force is to be a peacemaker. So if you are undo that division that created all the force of the physical universe, then you're generating peace. And that works in so many ways, because you're not going to be wanting to fight wars or or to be, attacking other human beings and so on. If you understand that you're attacking yourself when you do so. So in that sense, I would say that a peacemaker is one who is beyond, who achieves a state beyond the physical universe. And then that makes you a child of God, if God is defined as that state beyond the Big Bang.
Many spiritual traditions teach that humans already possess immortality but have forgotten it. Is it
Yes.
possible that Jesus came remembering it all?
Well, I would say that he was aware of it all, and that we are eternal in the sense that consciousness, if it's beyond time, has no beginning or end, right? But it's just a question of how do we begin, how do we continue? So if such a thing as reincarnation is true, then and we make our own destiny to the extent that we determine our own level of restriction. If we were to restrict ourselves such that we would no longer had the capacity to be human, then we might come back as an animal or something like that. That I think that does make sense that such a thing would be possible. So, but I think so. It's not so. It's quite simple actually to see using reason that eternality is already there, but it's a question of how. And what he came to recognize is that original source state, if you like, the beyond the Big Bang, of the oneness of all being, and how to reach that. And if any of us reached it, if any of us were true to it fully, so that all of our living was generated, everything that we do out of that knowledge, then you would be one and the same as that as well, because you would have made that happen. You would have lost all the lenses and filters that distort your perception of reality.
I think science would say that human beings think tens of thousands of thoughts per day, if not more. And
Mm,
we may speak of this as our monkey mind. But many near death experiencers comment that when they're on the other side, that all goes away.
mm,
Can you comment on that?
yes. So the a lot of what we have in our conscious mind is there to protect the physical body, because you have to stay alive if you're going to do anything while you are alive, by being alive, within a physical body. But the as soon as we are within atoms, which is within an enforced state, and the state beyond atoms is still not necessarily complete peace, to want of a better word, which would be the eternal state where we never would need to come back. But the enforcement is less, because when we're physically alive, we have a circulation of blood from the heart and so on, and a bioelectromagnetic field and so on, and we're within the frame of atoms, and people who come back from their NDEs often describe a shock at the grossness of being in a physical body compared to that wonderfully tranquil state that they had been in. And so I think it makes sense that everything would be clearer. And though we are, even now, we are being within the now, it is already containing all of the past and all the potentials for the future, but the noise of our biology and the matter of our bodies and experience and sensory experience and so on is blinding us to that to some extent. And so I think once that veil is lifted, once we're free of that, what they call interestingly, the people say the mortal coil, which a coil is how electromagnetic force is often generated. Um, that once we're free of that coil, then we would see much more clearly. Just like it's as though when we're in physical life, it's like we're under the water, if you like, and then suddenly we out of the depths of the dark ocean we can come up above the surface, and then suddenly there's light and everything looks clearer. So I think you can it would make sense that within the NDE experience people can see things more clearly and also perceive them, because although all our perception now is beyond our physical senses, the noises of the senses are so loud that it's difficult to be aware of that. and we get distracted and so on. But all of that noise has gone as soon as the heart stops and you're no longer bound within the body. I think that yes, NDEs definitely do show that beyond physical matter, perception, the mind, consciousness does see more clearly.
Some Christians may be uncomfortable linking the Shroud of Turin to NDEs or quantum physics. How do you respond to that concern for people who feel like this over-scientizes a sacred belief?
Depends what one means by what determines something to be sacred. I've never quite understood this notion that things have to be a mystery. And if God is all knowing and we're supposed to aspire to become like him, then why do we have to be in darkness if he said that he was the light? Did he say, if he is the light and we're in darkness, does he say, oh, don't let me in because I like you to be in darkness? So I don't think that yes, so in certain movements within institutional religions, political organizations might have said that things are supposed to be mysteries, might have. I'm no expert on what they have or haven't said, but it doesn't make sense to me that they should be. And in fact, if to take an example of something that one can see on the shroud, we can see the the blood stains, not from his hands, which actually anatomically now we know it wouldn't have been, but even whenever this image got there, it showed that the blood stains were on his wrist, which no medieval artist or forger would have known, by the way. All the paintings show it on the hands. But anyway, the blood stains from his wrists I'm getting somewhere with this, and the stab wound on his abdomen. Now remember his encounter with that was reported, his reported encounter with Thomas. Okay. Who couldn't believe that he was actually looking at Jesus, or Yeshua, as he probably would have known him. And he said, no, I'm here. If you don't believe me, put your finger in these wounds to test it for yourself. He didn't say, no, you must believe it and it's a mystery. Why did he offer to let him see it? And now we have the shroud, we have the physical evidence. Why should we ignore it? Just in the sense of wanting to stay ignorant, when he said, he didn't say he was darkness or ignorance. He said he'd come to bear witness to the truth. So why are we supposed not to know the truth?
You said that Jesus was in an upright position, according to the shroud, right?
When the image formed.
So does that mean he was lying on something that was angled, or was he
No.
standing?
Okay, neither. So when the dead body would have been placed, one would presume, in the tomb horizontally. Okay, and that fits with the blood stains, because it looks as though, and this is again, this isn't my own discovery, but I'm basing this on another of Dr. Lavoie's discoveries, that when you actually look at the shroud, you see it stretched out in 2 dimensions. Okay, and but he made a realization that people have been making a mistake all this time, or lots of people have. Well, I certainly was until I came to my senses after listening to him. That if you look at the blood, you see 2 things on the shroud. You see the blood stains and you see the image, and they don't all match. So, for example, there's what he refers to as an off-elbow blood stain on the shroud. And there's some blood stains that look like they're in the hair on the sides of the face. Okay. Now, what he realized is that when the body was placed in the tomb, presumably on its back, and we can see both bloodstains and image from the back of the body and the front. So it's a 14-foot long piece of cloth. It looks as though the body was laid down flat on it, and then it was folded over the top of the head and down to the feet, so the front and the back of the feet. Okay. And the way that he made sense of why are you seeing a bloodstain off the elbow and why are you seeing bloodstains on the hair, what he realized, and when he said it, I thought this should have been obvious to me, but I hadn't seen it until he pointed it out. What we're seeing are the bloodstains that look like they're in the hair, actually from the face. Because when the shroud was wrapped on the body, it would have, because of gravity, it would have folded round the face. But then now we're looking at the shroud and it's flat, it's straight. Okay. So, but then if the image was in the same way, if the image had formed by some sort of contact process or by any process with the cloth curved around like that, then when you flattened it out, you wouldn't see what we do now see, which is an undistorted image of a face. You'd see the face pulled out at the sides. Okay, so where we see the blood stains from the face, you would see part of the face. So instead, it looks as though at the moment of image formation, the cloth wasn't by gravity kept around the sides of the body and the face. It was flat in front of and behind the man. And now what Dr. Lavoie realized is that and this is from doing simple experiments with getting people to lie down and stand up and so on, people with long hair, you would expect the hair to be behind him. Okay. And you would expect if he were laying flat that where we see the image of the back of the body, there should be flattening from gravity at the shoulders, the buttocks and the calves. It's not there. There's no flattening. It's all round. And the hair is not behind him. It's draped down onto his shoulders. So this was his eureka moment, if you like, that there were two different events here. One is the bloodstains, which is the body supine, laid out flat, and then something happened. That body that had been laying flat somehow became upright. And if you look at the feet are in different positions. They're not as you would expect, the sort of soles of the feet downwards and so on, as though someone was standing. It looks as though at the moment of image formation, as strange as it may sound, this is what the scientific evidence is pointing to, that dead body had somehow stopped being horizontal on the slab, was now vertical, and the shroud, instead of being wrapped around him, was hanging down in front and behind him as like a flat sheet, flat at the front and flat at the back, curved over the top of his head. And there was a burst of intense radiant energy that came from that body that was suspended above the ground. And it's interesting that, we're talking about peacemakers reducing force. Well, it was as though, just as walking on the water implies that gravity wasn't, what was happening to his body was less enforced. Okay. So somehow that seems to be demonstrated again. And I alluded to a quote from David Bohm earlier, which I didn't quite complete. I started to say at the beginning of it about how light for light, and this is not, I'm not talking metaphorically now, I'm talking literally from Einstein's relativity. This has been proven that from the perspective of a light beam, there's no time or space elapsing or moved between from its beginning to its endpoint. It's what it moves on what physicists call the null cone on space-time diagrams, meaning null, meaning zero, meaning no space and no time passing if you're traveling on that cone where light is, which means that beginning and end of the light beam are the same, are not in separate places, and they're not at different times. It's all instantaneous. But the second point that Bohm made is that it appears that matter is frozen light, that somehow matter has come from light that has become in some way frozen to make time become a reality. Because if all that was in the universe was light, there'd be no time, because beginning and end are all one and the same. And so my point about time is it happens when matter happens, and matter happens because of the separation, that sentience has generated being that is less than its full potential. It's a lot to get over in a short a short talk. I do go over it in more depth in the book, but that perhaps what happened in that moment is that the matter, to a very small degree, that there was an unfreezing of that light that made the atoms of his body such that they shone. And we did the calculations. It would only take a very, very tiny, because of E equals mc squared. It's not very much matter. Literally, if you release all the mass energy from a mustard seed, you might move a mountain from that, because of how much energy is contained. So it's a tiny, tiny proportion is all that's needed. And perhaps at that moment that the image formed, when he did come back to the body, not as coming back from a near-death experience, but some kind of actual, archaeologically confirmed, if you like, resurrection event, for want of a better word, that's what released that light.
I realize I'm asking you to speculate here, but why was he vertical, in your opinion? And is it possible that instead of it being a resurrection, it was a revivification? The light, the explosion of light happened, and he became physically mortal again and moved on and finished out his life.
How would you define the difference between revivification and resurrection?
Well, the resurrection would be he remained as a incorporeal being, a bodiless being. But I'm saying the body became alive again.
Okay. I mean, if he asked Thomas to put his hands in the wound, if he broke bread and walked with people and talked with them, and they saw a physical person there, then to some extent that is the case. But all of us as human beings are beyond corporeal as well as corporeal. And in fact, this light that I refer to, it's interesting that, and this is across many religions, at least those that have artistic depictions of their teachers, because as you may know, in Judaism and Islam, it's people are forbidden from making images of prophets or whatever, or especially of God, because it's thought that is sort of idolatry or whatever. But in Buddhism and in Buddhist art and in depictions from people who've followed Jesus, they often show people with light around them. And in fact, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, it's said that sometimes, that people can actually physically see light around certain people. And of course, during what's often referred to as the Transfiguration event, he was seen to shine then, and that was before he had died. So I think it's not sort of a black and white thing as whether somebody, because nobody is fully corporeal, nobody is just a body. And until they die and leave a dead body behind them. But he and people who achieve towards achieving what he did are showing how it's possible to be more than a body, as we're always all more than a body. Just as I said, all our perception is beyond the senses. So whatever term we use to describe it, and of course you're right, that I am to some extent speculating here, because much as I'd like to be able to interview him and and ask him what really happened, I'm just going by. I haven't been able to do that. I'm going by the physical evidence that was left, and making a very sort of human speculation about. But having said that, I do back it up, with with science and reasoned evidence, that I believe the readers or your viewers can sort of consider for themselves to verify whether it makes sense. But I think they'll agree that if they think about it, that their senses aren't what sees, that their choices are theirs to make. All you need to accept is that, and then you have seen that each person, each human being, has a power greater than all the atoms in the universe, and so once you recognize that, then all the rest fits into place. And for me, the significance of the shroud is just in showing that one human being at least, I don't know if there are others, but one human being at least has demonstrated that full potential that all of us can achieve.
Dr. Silverman, if people want to find out more about your book, A Burst of Conscious Light, Near-Death Experiences, The Shroud of Turin, and the Limitless Potential of Humanity, do they go to a website or Amazon?
So the book is available on Amazon, and also through my publisher, Inner Traditions, and it's also, there's a website, andrewsilverman.co.uk, specifically about the book, and lightoftheshroud.com, about my some of the presentations that I've made, and sort of lectures I've given, and so on. So yes, it is on Amazon, including Amazon.com for the North American sort of viewers. And it's called A Burst of Conscious Light, as you said. Yeah.
Before we finish up, can you leave us with a last positive message?
To me, the most positive thing that it tells me is how grand the scope and potential of all human beings is, including all your viewers and their loved ones, but also all humanity. So to know that you never end, that death is just a transition, and that you inside you have the potential to achieve what these great people have shown us, that all human beings have that same potential. It's not easy, I'm sure, and but they have shown it's possible.
Dr. Silverman, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.